as long as I can remember, I have been fascinated with logos. And I love when a designer can take a complex idea and reduce it into a simple, iconic form. And growing up in Canada, I was fortunate to be surrounded by many of these types of logos. For example, as a kid, I loved watching animated films by the National Film Board of Canada. And at the beginning of each one, they had this really beautiful logo that was just a green man with his arms outstretched that turned into an eye. Or the public broadcaster, CBC. That was a very simple idea that was a C at the core, broadcasting out to Canada and the world. Or if you're a graphic designer and you study graphic design, probably the most famous Canadian logo of them all was for the Canadian National Railways. And this was a really simple idea. It was a single thickness line that symbolizes the movement of people, materials, and messages from one point to another. And this symbol is everywhere in Canada. The railroad, Canada was built on the railroad, so you see this everywhere you go. Or how about the centennial symbol? This was for Canada's 100th anniversary, and it's a really simple idea of 11 triangles that make up a maple leaf. And although this logo is 50 years old, you can find it everywhere, from sidewalks to parks all across the country, from coast to coast to coast. But my favorite logos were the sports logos. This one is for the Canadian Grand Prix. And it's a very simple idea again. It's the curves of a racetrack, it's a C for Canada, and it has the checkered flag symbolizing the end of the race. But my favorite of all of them as a kid growing up was the Toronto Blue Jays logo. And this one is much different than the other ones I showed you. It's a little bit more complex, but as a kid, I loved it. As you can see, that's all I wanted to wear growing up. And even when I was making art, and I know these are terrible, terrible drawings, but I was obsessed with the logo. And I remember as a kid just really poring over the details of these logos and always wanting to draw them. But I have to admit, I had a second love, and it was their rival team. And that was the Montreal Expos. And I really, really loved this logo too. And it took me a long time to understand what it was that I loved about the logo. I loved the way it looked, I loved the colors, but it took me a little while to decode what was happening in here. And when you break it down, there's an M for Montreal, an E for Expos, and a B for baseball, all contained in this one simple emblem. But the one that has been the most influence on my life was the identity for the Montreal 1976 Olympic Games. And again, it's this really simple, iconic, memorable logo. And when you break down the symbolism, there's tons of really great things in there. First off, there's the Olympic podium. And then the most brilliant part, I think, of this logo is that there is a track at the center of the logo, which is the heart of the Summer Games. And then, of course, there is the Olympic rings itself. And again, all contained in this really simple emblem. And what I love about this is that the identity system that was built around it was absolutely stunning and beautiful, from the posters and the mascots to the tickets to the print publications. There was seemingly an endless array of really beautiful design that was produced for this games. And that really inspired me, and I wanted to be an Olympic designer myself. And when Vancouver won the bid to host the 2010 Olympic Games, I felt like this was one of the things that I'd been put on the earth to do, to help create symbols to represent my country in 2010. So I was on a team of 6 designers. We were responsible for producing everything from field of play, podiums, fence fabric, publications, tickets, mascots, the whole thing. Between the 6 of us, there was 10,000 applications, and as an example, one of those applications was torch, or one was metal. So although one project, there's a lot of effort that goes into these sort of deliverables. And what was really remarkable about those games was that there was a sense of national pride that I have never experienced before in my country. You know, this is on Granville Street after Sidney Crosby scored in overtime to defeat the Americans in hockey gold medal. And I was proud as a Canadian. And after working on these games, another one of the designers on the team, Ben Hulse, who's my business partner now, he was approached by some colleagues and went on to work for the Canadian Olympic team. So this is the organization that sends athletes to the Olympic Games. And they were wondering if there was a way to kind of capitalize and build off this energy that was very evident, as you can see in this photo across country. This was their logo, and this was the logo that they asked if you know, could it be improved? And I mean, it's not bad, but it's not very good. There's so much happening there. There's, you know, the maple leaf, there's a cauldron, there's a flame, there's a gradient in the flame, there's a bunch of text that runs around it, and it's just overly complicated. I'm going to change the slide because I want to look at that. But, so anyways, when we started this project, and when you're thinking about the Canadian Olympic team, obviously the starting point is the maple leaf. And while doing research for this project, one of the questions that came up was, well, you know, how long has the maple leaf been used to represent Canada? And that question changed my life. From there, that embarked me on a project that I wasn't anticipating, but it was about making a film. And up until 1965, this was the flag that Canada flew. And I couldn't believe this. I grew up in Canada, I was born in the 80s, all I've known was the maple leaf flag, and I couldn't believe this was used for hundreds of years before Canada had its own flag. And I had to understand why that was. So there's a lot of entry points into how the Canadian flag came to be, but I'm just going to offer one through a design perspective. And in 1956, there was a crisis that broke out in Egypt over the Suez Canal. The war broke out between the Egyptians and the British, the French, and the Israelis. And a Canadian foreign minister at the time, through the UN, his name was Lester Pearson, ended up brokering the peace deal. And the problem that happened so they figured out how to create peace in the region, and when Canadian troops were on the ground to help keep the peace, the Egyptians didn't want them there because the flag that they flew had the Union Jack on it. And this is something that could have been easily overlooked, you know, especially after the crisis was over and no one was at war anymore. But Lester Pearson kept this in the back of his mind. And when he ran to be Prime Minister 5 years later, part of his platform was to create a unique flag for Canada. And that started the most heated debate in Canada, because you had people that had been there for generations that wanted to keep the heritage, that felt that you know, there was no need to change the flag, yet there was a younger demographic that felt that flag no longer spoke to them. So what ended up happening was they ended up putting together a committee. And this committee was made up of various political organizations. Compared to the US, where it's a two-tier system, you have Republican and Democratic. In Canada, you have many parties. You have the Liberal Party, you have Conservative Party, you have NDP Party, Green Party, etc. So they put together a committee of everybody, and they gave them 6 weeks to design a flag. Now, I don't know, there's probably a lot of designers in this room, and as a practicing designer myself, there is nothing scarier than design by committee. That's the worst, because the process is convoluted, and ultimately it just does not produce great design. However, this is what they have. So this is kind of how the finalist flags went down. So you had this flag, and this is known as the Pearson pennant. This is the flag the Prime Minister wanted. This was his favorite. This is the one that he wanted to be the Canadian flag. Now, the opposition party, the Conservatives, they didn't want any of this. They didn't want this flag. They didn't even want to deal with this process, but they definitely didn't want this flag. So they had put together a few other options. So this was another finalist, and it's kind of terrible, you know, but you can see what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to be inclusive of Canada's heritage, you know. Politically speaking, Canada was really founded by the British and the French, although the land that became Canada goes back at least 12,000 years and to the indigenous populations that were there for. But so this was a flag, and then this was an option too, which is, I mean, this is terrible. There's 3 flags in one flag here, right? Like it's just lacking anything. So, but something happened in the final hour. They submitted a 4th concept. Or sorry, so these are the 3 finalists. You can tell there's nothing really great here. Final hour, they submitted the 4th concept, and this is the 4th concept. And it was just a single maple leaf. And because the Conservatives weren't going to vote for the blue one, everyone ended up voting for this one flag. And this was the flag that was chosen. Now, depending on how familiar you are with the Canadian flag, this isn't the final flag. So when this happened, the leader of the flag committee, John Matheson, acknowledged that it's pretty good, but it's not all the way there. So this is John Matheson, and at the time, leading up into 1967, Canada was hosting Expo 67, which was the World's Fair. And so the government had a design department that was working on trade show booths and exhibitions and these sort of things. So John Matheson went to this design department and talked to the executive director. His name was Patrick Reed, and told him, look, I need you guys to look at this flag. This is our last chance before this becomes the flag. And Patrick Reed then asked his best designer at the time. His name was Jacques Sensier. And these are the 3 people that were in the room when they drew the flag. And if you know a little bit about the history of this flag, there's tons of people that claim authorship over it. And frankly, like I think it's something that doesn't really need an author. It's something that's owned by all Canadians. But regardless, these were the 3 people that were in the room. And when they looked at that flag, they came to a realization that there was something about it that could be improved. So the gentleman in the middle, Patrick Reed, is going to walk us through what they did to change the flag.
We had a design which had the 2 red bars, the formalized maple leaf in the middle, and was at 13 points. The 13-pointer just looked a little too heavy at the base. Jacques and I discussed this, and finally we agreed to drop 2 points to bring it down to 11 points, and that was it.
So a very, very subtle change. They took a maple leaf that was at 13 points and reduced it to 11, and that was it. And there are many things that I love about this flag. You know, one is that when you think about the history of flags, typically they're the result of war. They're battles, lives are lost, countries are conquered, and then a new flag is made. In Canada, our flag was made by a committee, by people working together that came from different backgrounds and different political affiliations, but they worked together to make the flag. I also love that the symbolism is the maple leaf from the sugar maple tree. The flag is literally inspired by the soil of our country. There are no lions, there are no crowns, there are no stars, there's stripes. You know, I think that has gone on to play a big role in who Canadians are. And finally, what makes this flag brilliant in my mind is the single maple leaf. There's not 2 leaves, there's not that sprig of 3 leaves, there's 1 leaf that says no matter how many people we are all one. And what's amazing about this too is that the government didn't just stop there. They created a whole identity system around that. As I was mentioning, the history of Canada is an English and French history. And although Canada is 90% speaking English, we still have that French population, and they're both official languages. So the government produced an identity system to always treat these 2 languages equally. And so I get it in a way of like maybe somebody's looking at that and thinking, what's the big deal? Like, it's just a flag with Helvetica, flush left, ragged right, the English is beside the French. And I guess although that is true, there is so much more behind that. It speaks to unity. It speaks to communication. And those are things that I think are absolutely brilliant. And when design can bring people together, that is where the magic happens. And when I started to discover these stories, there was something inside of me that I had to learn more. All those logos that I showed in the beginning of this presentation, I needed to meet the people that made them, because in some way they have played a role in how I identify as a Canadian. And frankly, I just wanted to learn the stories behind them and understand what lessons as designers we can take away from that era. So I decided I was going to make a film. And I had never made a film before. I didn't even know anyone that had made a film before. But I just bought the gear and taught myself how to use it using YouTube tutorials, and ended up hitting the road. And I began cold calling designers from that era. I called them up and told them as a filmmaker, it was a lie, but I told them that I really want to tell this story. And I'm so fortunate that many people sat down and shared a morning or an afternoon or multiple days with me. And so it took me 6 years to make it. If you don't believe me, we can watch me age in these video clips here. But it was incredible. I was able to meet so many of my own heroes and learn about their work. And many of which, and I'm going to share a few clips with you guys today. So designing for a film about design. I'm going to talk about this a little bit. And I mean, it's not even just a design film. This is about a specific type of design. The 60s was about the crystallization of communication, structure, order, rationality. And you'll meet Fritz Gottschalk this afternoon. This isn't a job for them. This is their life. And so how do you design under, like, that's a lot of pressure, right? So I'm gonna talk through a few things about design for the film. So I worked with a really good friend of mine. His name's Alexander Shukas. We grew up together, and I asked him to help out with the overall design aesthetic of the film. And really the brief that we established was, how can we honor this time period? And he came back with two really brilliant ideas. The first was that everything should adhere to a grid. So this is a simple grid. This is used throughout the entire film. The second thing he said, at first it kind of scared me, but he said, one typeface, one weight, one size, one grid, that's it. And in theory, it's like, yeah, I love it. That's a great idea. It's about simplicity, the reduction. That's what that era is about. But then, like, you know, you scratch your head, like, how is that actually going to work throughout the film? But it did. So when you think about a lower third, so that's when someone's name appears on screen and their titles. So here's how a lower third would approach. Or, you know, what happens if they have a longer title? And, you know, so this grid system was able to fluctuate to kind of accommodate. And one other little detail here that we really want to put a lot of emphasis on was where people were born. Because the backstory of a lot of these symbols are that they were created by immigrants that moved to Canada, yet they were able to have a role in shaping the country that we know today. Or what happens when a photograph appears on screen? And how does the copy align with the photograph? So when you take the grid away, you know, maybe this is something you wouldn't notice right away when you watch the film, but everything still has this structure behind it. Or what happens if you have a piece of archival video and you need to caption it with a date and you need a subtitle, right? So although it was a very strict system, there was a ton of flexibility in it as well. So into music. So music was obviously a huge component of any type of motion picture. And I have no musical background. I didn't play musical instruments growing up, but my business partner, Ben Hulse, he comes from a musical background. He was in rock bands and toured for many years. And not only is he an incredible musician, but he's also incredible at articulating music and sounds and ideas. And he really helped write the brief for what the music would be. So our really starting spot was, you know, what does a circle or a triangle or a square sound like? And maybe that's really abstract, but that's where we began. And when you think about this era of design, it was all about, again, that clarity, that precision. And so when you try to think of 1960s music, what would be the equivalent on the music side? And what's interesting about what happened in the 60s was that's when the synthesizer really became a thing. You know, Beatles' Abbey Road was one of the first albums to really utilize the synthesizer. So we use that as a jump-off spot. But at the same time, we also understood that designers like Fritz Gottschalk or Burton Kramer, they probably wouldn't listen to, you know, really synth-heavy soundtracks. So we wanted to offset that too with some kind of organic piano melodies. So I'm going to play 2 bits of music for you guys, and then we're going to put it together with some pictures. So the first bit of music is this kind of piano exploration. So what I really loved about that piece of music, so that was written by a friend of mine, Michael Rocha, and to me what I love about that is it kind of feels like the creative process. You know, you're wandering around, you're trying different things, you're working really fast, and then you're slowing down and kind of reflecting. So that was a huge, when that piece of music was written, that was really influential to how the rest of the film would sound. And then on the synth bass side, I had another friend, Mark Lazeski, who really dialed in these synth sounds. And the synth sound is about the sound of the future. And this is what the synth sound sounds like. Okay, so now we have these 2 different styles of music, and let's put it together now with some picture. So one of the challenges and one of the things that, you know, over this 6-year process, when I talked to designers about making the film, they would always ask, like, oh, wow, what are you going to do for the opening titles? And, you know, for years, I had bigger fish. I had to figure out what the story was before getting to the titles. But this was something that we began working on earlier this year. And something happened just by accident. And the way the film is structured, there's these kind of 14 little segments that flow one to the other. It just so worked out that we had 14 opening credits that we had to have in the opening of the film. So it was like this perfect marriage. So working with Alex Shukas again, we discussed how can we play with the typography, play with the grid, and also allude to the 14 chapters that are going to come up in the film. So I'm going to play for you now the opening 2 minutes of the film. The film opens in Zurich, Switzerland with Fritz Gottschalk, who is presenting after this afternoon. And then there's a little cold open and then into the titles.
Okay, these are envelopes from Canada. Let me open them and we do a time warp of 30 years. Look at that. Look how I start. My love is graphic design. The way things function, the thinking behind it, and of course, very important, the way they look. What is graphic design? Graphic design is one concise piece of imagery, all condensed into one.
as you saw, this is the kind of title card in the film. This is the way that the film title appears. And again, of course, it was built on the grid, and you don't ever see the grid, but that's what the grid looks like. So after we kind of gone through the sequence and figured out the typography, the next major component of the film from a design perspective is what does the poster look like? And again, I worked with Alex, and the challenge I gave him was, we've created this typographic style for the film. How can that translate into the printed world too, with the poster? And this is what Alex came back with. So take the title card, and you build a poster around it. And it's a really simple approach to typography, again, that feels like, we wanted this to feel like it was from that era, that we're honoring the time period. And just working with the grid, working with the structure, but still trying to be playful and dynamic. And so this is the poster, and okay, so I'm going to play a couple more chapters for you guys today. So I know Fritz is coming up later today, but I thought I would play the Gottschalk and Ash segment of the film. So this part of the film opens up with the Ash part. His name's Stuart Ash, Fritz's business partner, and it opens with that identity that I showed at the beginning of the film for the Canada Centennial. Oh, actually, hold on. One other thing I want to say before that. So in this Gottschalk and Ash section, you'll also hear both of those two different types of music. So you're going to hear the really loud synthesizer as we get into the sequence showing the work. And then at the end of the segment, you're going to hear the piano come back in that creates a little bit more of a sentimentality, a little bit more of an emotional feel. So we play out both of those and we contrast those. Okay, now let's play.
That's much more reasonable for people to draw than the flag we actually do have. So that's an example, I think, of design really genuinely bringing people together around an idea.
In 1963, I started working as an apprentice, and it was through that relationship that I had the opportunity, as one of my first jobs, to design the centennial symbol for Canada. The strategy that we came down to, amongst all the things that would be appropriate to represent Canada, was the idea that a maple leaf and the elements representing the provinces and territories would be the appropriate symbol.
Every sidewalk that was poured in 1967 is stamped with that logo. The fronts of locomotives that were built or came online in 1967 have the centennial identity. A park that was built anywhere in Canada in that period has that identity somewhere on it. Stuart Ash created an icon that is brilliant in its simplicity, stunning in its relationship to the new flag, but not slavishly so. We should all be so lucky as to design something that clear in our careers.
It took me actually an hour to come up with the idea and almost 6 months to present it. But that's the beauty of design and the frustration of design, because you're in search for something within your mind. After Centennial, my thought was to work as a designer in Europe. And I phoned Fritz asking him his opinion.
You know what I said this year? I'll teach you all the tricks. If we get along with each other, we start a company. And we did.
problem was that it was too frail. So what we did was simplify the shapes of the symbol to give it a much stronger, more contemporary form. Sky Dome was a retractable roof. It was a simple idea of letting the sun shine in through the roof. Fritz and I started working together, and we shared, the same appreciation for typography and graphics.
Very simply, it was a question of 1 and 1 equals at least 2.5. We were really yin and yang. He is the Anglophone, generous, he's also a big guy, presents well, smooth and, like Anglophones are, and I'm the Swiss guy who, and together it worked very, very well. He's a real Canadian, he played hockey, he loves nature, he loves to ski. His way of looking at things are, to me, wonderful. Canadians and Swiss are similar in terms of behavior. Canadians are not as loud as some other people. The political setup is very similar to Switzerland, and they are real, true democracies. And you see that in the way people live and what they aspire to.
You guys are too nice. I like you guys. Okay, cool. So that was kind of Gottschalk and Ash, and you get a sense of the variety of music and how it can kind of make you feel differently. So I'm going to play one more section for you guys. So as I was talking about, to me, there's no doubt the Canadian flag is the symbol that represents Canada for sure, and that I think created a new narrative for Canada. But there was a symbol before that really, I think none of this happens without it. And this was the symbol for the Canadian National Railways. And the backstory is really interesting because the Canadian National Railway, and CN basically, they were bigger than just a railway. But heading into the 60s, they were modernizing, yet the public felt that they were this old, dusty organization. So they made the realization that, hey, maybe it's actually our logo and our identity that's the problem. So here's the backstory behind Canada's most famous logo.
We're back in 1959. Canadian National was concerned about the logo that we were using, the Maple Leaf logo, and felt that it didn't match the kind of progress that CN was making in its identity and image. The research came back saying that the public felt, as we suspected, that we were old-fashioned, anachronistic, and all of these things conspired to prove that we needed some serious upgrading. Canada was in its infancy. There was a lot of graphic design around, but not much in the way of corporate identity experience. Went to our ad agencies in New York, and they said, New York is where it's at, we'll put you in touch with some people. We found James Volkes, who ran his own little firm, James Volkes Inc. He was a young, talented designer.
When he was blunt, and he said, you don't want a logo. What you want is a corporate identity program.
And I said, well, you need sort of a more comprehensive thing instead of a sort of drive-by design job, because this is pretty complex. And so we got to talk more about design and CN. And after a while, he said, would you be interested in doing it yourself, but you would have to open an office in Montreal to service the clients. And I said, sure, why not? What a big break.
He worked for several months on trains and trucks and all these other things without having a logo to work with.
I went to Toronto, and I met Alan Fleming, and I said, I think you could help out a lot on this. And so then we started doing design sketches.
Alan came in one day and said, I got a wonderful project. I get to do a new logo for CN. Oh, I said, oh, this is terrific.
My sketches of the CN, and it was a flowing CN. You know, I said, just so it's something that makes motion of some sort. And Alan sent back a lot of, you know, sketches, but they were too fluid. They didn't look corporate enough to me.
So we laid out what he was doing. And I said, there's nothing there that you're going to sell. Oh, he said, yeah, this one's pretty good. Nah, we said, that's not really good. He said, don't worry about it, I'm going to sell this one. It was really not very good. It was okay, it was ordinary. But there wasn't really a winner there.
I think it was James who initiated this. Said, why don't you just try putting together the letters this way as a squarish C, curved corners, and then join it up to the end and continue the same kind of corners and see what you get.
I was on the plane, instead of having a scotch, he loved scotch. And he said, I realized I had missed it. So he said, I drew this on the napkin. When I got to the hotel, I got a piece of paper and I drew it, tightened it up. And he said, I didn't show them the other ones at all, I just took in this one.
It's a single thickness line, which means it doesn't age. It symbolizes the movement of men, materials, and messages from one point to another. The symbol carried its own authority. It spoke for itself. It demanded space around it. It resisted embellishment. It just said what was intended to be said. Leave it there. It was an immediate sensation with the media in this country. It was front page.
I think a lot of the appeal of it was that people could see a train track. They could read it as an illustration. They could pretend that it also was a picture of something.
My mother's neighbors liked it, and they don't know anything about design.
This is so good. I will draw it. I will show you something. I'll tell you why I like it. Here we have, you know, to do C and N. Doesn't do anything. Maybe I should take a typeface like that. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't do anything. So he gets this intuition. Oh, I begin to see a railway train going this direction. You see, there's just it's arriving. Now, what is interesting, he also took this dimension and he made it similar to this dimension. See, this now makes this fantastic symbol understandable to anyone. This is why I love it.
Okay, so I also don't want to misguide you. So I don't want to misguide you. Canada isn't just great design. There is some terrible, terrible design happening too. And what kills me, what breaks my heart, is when some of these historically beautiful symbols that have been in use for decades, if not a half century, they get changed. And it just drives me absolutely crazy. So here's some of the worst of.
This whole craze over the past 20 years for rebranding companies and for changing logo marks every time you fucking get a new CEO just makes me insane. These things have history. Stupid companies, they keep trying to want to change it because they're aware of that history. Maybe that history isn't so good. Or maybe they think, no, we're not about that old stuff anymore. We're about the new. We're going in new directions, you know, so we have to have a new logo. I just think it's incredibly misguided.
We did an image for a bank, you know, which is changed. I mean, that's so awful, you know, I don't even want to talk about it.
When they updated the logo in 1992, how did that make you feel?
Violated, outraged.
The CBC symbol had a problem. One of the applications of the symbol was to put it on the screen, and have it stand out. It had to be simpler. So I simplified it.
Things have to change because the world changes, you know. Now, how they change, that's another aspect.
The original Ontario mark was designed by a very good friend, colleague of mine. I think it was a great mark to the extent that I've followed its evolution. When the change was made to what I picked it up in popular language, 3 citizens in a trillium-shaped hot tub. Yeah.
You know, there are 3 things which are very important in design: vision, courage, and determination. And this has, this one, none of the 3, instead of vision, has come as fear. I mean, look how you see it's fibrillating in the space. There's 3 guys there. It's bad from a graphic, visual, perceptive point of view. It's just bad.
They fucked with it. See, they wrecked it. They totally wrecked it. It just looks like 3 white-tailed deer with their butts glued together or something. It just does not look like anything you want to be a part of.
Nothing in connection with corporate identity is a quick fix. You got to put a lot in at the front end and wait for it. The patient waiting is perhaps the hardest part. Some managements, they think they should see all these results come instantly, and that's not the way it works.
So for me, I think Lauren at the end there touches on a really great point of why a lot of this is happening, is that, you know, I think we have, in Canada at least, there's organizations, there's corporations, there's governments that want to show progress, that they are making change, that they're updating, that they're part of the future, but that's not the way to do it through their logo. There's so much more you can do around it. However, sometimes some of these logos are just kind of terrible, and they do need to be updated. So going back to this logo, where this whole kind of project originated, and a lot of these thoughts that I ended up, these threads that I ended up pulling that just kept unraveling. So when working with Ben Hulson and myself, and we had 2 other designers, Andrew Simpson and Adam Bogner, but what we wanted to try to do here was try to put in an identity that had sort of those timeless qualities. You know, you look at that CN logo, and that's as relevant as it was in 1960 as it is today. And timelessness in design is extremely difficult to do. And when you look at this, I mean, it is dated, right? Like that gradient just speaks like 1990s design to me. And you have the maple leaf where they just modified all the curves just for no reason. I mean, the leaf that we have is beautiful. Why wouldn't you just use the period of the leaf? So we tried to take the philosophy of that generation, of simplicity, of communication, and what we put into place for them was this. And it's just an incredibly simple idea. It's supposed to represent the Canadian Olympic team. It's the maple leaf, the rings contained in an oval. What more do you need? And I mean, and then beyond that, we built around it. So although the logo is incredibly simple, we built a little bit more complex applications around it. So here's an example of 2 Olympic athletes wearing the logo. And then we also created this kind of mosaic graphic that, you know, was just playing off of all the geometry that was contained in the maple leaf and expanding it out and integrating it with the reds from Canada and also the Olympic colors here as well. And then you can kind of take this graphic and apply it on things like stationery. So you have this incredibly simple logo, but then you have a much more vibrant identity that kind of contrasts it as well. And you know, here it is kind of in a 3-dimensional space as well. And what's really interesting was, actually, it was in the Sochi Games in 2014, they did a study of the awareness of Olympic brands around the world, and Canada came in #1. And to me, this just speaks to the simplicity of the approach. Distilling down that maple leaf into a truly iconic form just becomes memorable and impressionable and lasts. And I get it. Like, it's not that, you know, it's not that if you have a bad logo, like, people aren't going to die. Like, I get that. It's not, you know, this isn't life or death. But to me, when design is executed right, when it looks right, and most importantly, when it feels right, it has the power to inspire generations and build nations. If you'd like to follow along, the documentary film, you can find us on Instagram. It's Design Can Film. Our studio work is at durell, and my personal is durell. Thank you guys very much for having me. I appreciate it.